Welcome, Comadres and Friends. I'm Dr. Nora de Hoyos Comstock, national and international founder of Las Comadres para las Americas. The book club's leadership team and I are pleased to have you join us for tonight's teleconference as we celebrate our book club's quinceañero. Yes, our book club is 15 years old this year. It has been our privilege to support Latino authors throughout the many years, and we look forward to the next 15. We'd also like to extend a warm welcome to readers following us on our live Twitter chat. Tonight, please help us welcome authors Daniel Loedel and Kathleen Alcala. Their interviews will start shortly. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourselves on mute. You can keep your videos on. And we suggest you put yourself on speaker mode just so the speaker is big in front of you, but gallery works just as well. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them. First, let's start with our book club's history. Comadre Tess?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tess Tobin, and I'm the book club submissions coordinator. And I'd like to just give you a brief history of the book club. Our first book club gathering was in July 2004 in New York in Comadre Maria Ferrer's apartment. After a hiatus, Nora Comstock re-envisioned and relaunched the book club nationwide to promote work of Latino authors to every book lover, to bring our community to bookstores, and to support our writers. We started our teleconferences in October of 2006. We are in our 15th year of sharing works by Latino authors with all of you. We created the teleconferences and book clubs to entice everyone to read more Latino authors, to learn about Latino roots and the different perspectives on Latino culture and heritage. Our book club and teleconferences are open to all, not just Latinos. We are creating a space for everyone to explore the Latino writer's mind and soul as portrayed through the written word. We encourage you to join our local book club in your city or time zone. We have clubs in 12 cities that are meeting virtually. There is sure to be one that can fit your schedule. If your city doesn't have one, why not help us start one? For more information about our book club, visit our website, latinolit.com. So please invite others to join us. Comadre Karen?
Welcome, Comadres and Friends, to our February 2022 Zoom teleconference. I'm Karen Gonzalez, Assistant Coordinator for the Las Comadres and Friends Book Club, Denver Comadres Book Club Facilitator, and co-founder of the Colorado Alliance of Latino Mentors and Authors. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will begin with our first interview of author Daniel Loedel. Daniel Loedel is a senior editor at Bloomsbury. Previously, he was an editor at Simon & Schuster for 8 years. Prior to becoming a book editor and moving to Brooklyn, New York, he lived in Buenos Aires. Heides, Argentina is his first novel and was inspired by his half-sister who was disappeared in Argentina in 1978 by the military dictatorship. Interviewing Daniel is Kim Montoya. Comadre Kim has been dedicated to Las Comadres para las Americas since she joined in 2013. She started at Las Comadres Heartland Topeka Network Book Club in Kansas when she moved from Denver, and when the COVID-19 pandemic closed the libraries, she combined the Heartland Topeka Network with the Denver Network and started a book club meetings via Zoom. Comadre Kim, take it away.
Thank you, Comadre Karen. And thank you, Daniel, for agreeing to be interviewed and being a part of the Las Comadres and Friends International Book Club. First, I want to congratulate you on your debut novel, Hades, Argentina. I read the book and I found the book to be very fascinating and at the same time a little complex. I think when you first came on, you mentioned it was a hard read, and I thought, and I think a few of the other book club members also thought that, but I think as you continue to read and the stories start to unfold, I really got into it, and I was just really fascinated on the creativity that you used in writing this story. So it was a very a good week, a good read. We have several questions to ask you, and we're not sure we'll get through them all, but I'm sure as you talk about your book, some of the questions might be answered. So the first question that we'd like for you to answer, or just to expand on a little bit, and this for the readers who may have not read your book, or maybe in the process of reading it and haven't read through it completely yet. And for others who are hoping, that it gets read, would you please give us just a brief synopsis? We're not giving out too much, just a brief synopsis of what your novel is about.
I'm muted. Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's especially meaningful as I don't know, I think like Argentines aren't always included in sort of Latino, like understand like that umbrella, and it's very moving, especially for me as a native New Yorker. And it's very nice to be here, and thank you for those kind words about the book. Yeah, so this is the story of Tomás Orilla, who 10 years after the military dictatorship in 1986 returns and essentially finds himself searching for the ghost of the woman he loved in a literal underworld, hence the title, Hades, Argentina. The ghost of a woman who has disappeared in 1976, and that underworld is basically composed of his memories of that time. So he sort of, in this journey, relives 1976 and the choices he made at that time. And we find out that in that year, this woman he was in love with, who was a very passionate resistance fighter against the dictatorship, asked Tomás to spy for her on his friend and mentor, the colonel, and then eventually to spy for her at a detention center, both of which he agrees to do out of love for her primarily. I mean, he's also sort of, he's against the dictatorship, but it's really, he's driven by love more than anything. And yeah, that's sort of the gist.
All right. You mentioned in the acknowledgements that this novel was inspired by your sister, Isabel. Could you please elaborate more on this and why you wanted to write this novel and how long this novel was in the works?
Yeah, so the character of Isabel in the novel is inspired by Isabel, my sister, who was a Montonera fighting against the dictatorship. She was disappeared in 1978. They're not, it's not a one-to-one equivalence by any means. It's a work of fiction, but that was the seed of the story. In some ways, this book was in the works my whole life. In some ways, it was in the actual process of writing, maybe, 3 or 4 years. But, I grew up with Isabel sort of as a ghost in my home. She wasn't talked about. There was a highly pixelated photo above my dad's bed. That was sort of how I first learned who like this person was, but he never sat me down and was like, this is your sister. And it took a really long time to sort of the trickle of information to realize that she was dead, to realize that she had been disappeared. For a long time, I thought she was an activist in a much more sort of generic way, handing out pamphlets, doing graffiti, that kind of thing. And very slowly, and around like 2014, I would say, I started really digging into her life more and discovered she, had taken up actual arms against the regime. And yeah, so it was a very slow burn. I mean, I think it took me a long time to wrestle with it properly, I think, because it was so often in the background of my life. I had to kind of pull it to the foreground at a certain point because it informed everything around me. My father's sense of guilt and for not being able to save her, just so much of my life. And I would say that in a sense, the book took the form it did of a search for a ghost, because this was a story of me searching for the ghost of my sister whom I never met. I mean, I tried to write the book as a realist novel initially, and I failed. I couldn't do it. I tried, it didn't work. It didn't speak to me the right way. So that was sort of that's my rambling explanation of how this book came to be.
No, I thought that was, I was able to read an article that you wrote about the background of this book and your family. And so I had wondered myself, is like, how do you started writing a book like this? And so it was interesting how you decided, to make this more creatively and use the ghost aspect of it. I thought that was just a really creative way to tell that story.
Thank you.
How did your sister disappear, and how old were you when you found out she disappeared, and did it change the family? Because I know this is a very personal book for you because of what happened.
So the interesting thing is I don't know how old I was because I was never sat down. It was never explained to me. I mean, I think my earliest memories of how it was a tragedy are sort of adjacent to the story of her disappearance. I remember my father once telling me a story about how he was with her on the beach and she stepped on a piece of glass and started bleeding, and how he started crying because he telling the story about how he wasn't able to protect her. And I'm a kid, not really understand, like, why are you crying about her stepping on a piece of glass? Clearly he was really crying about something much deeper.
Yeah.
As to how it shaped my family, I mean, enormously. I think in some ways the character of Tomás has some parallels with both my father and my half brother. My father in the sense of guilt. My father felt he was not able to save Isabel, and talking to him about it much later, I'm talking in the last 5 years, 10 years. And I asked, about his ability to make peace with this or whatever. He basically would say there is no peace. There's no, this wound does not close. And, my half brother sort of similarly, his whole life changed. I mean, he came to New York because Isabel was in the resistance and there was a raid on their home. That was how he fled to Uruguay and then from there to the US. So, I mean, and I probably wouldn't be alive if not. It's a very strange thing is to realize, like, I don't know. I don't know if I'd be alive in a weird way if not for the fact that Isabel was killed, which is a very strange sort of thing to consider philosophically. I forget if there was a third part of the question.
No, I just wanted to know how, because you wanted to write this book and it was going to be very hard write, I think. And it was going to be bringing up a lot of memories with the family and just curious to know if that, how the family accepted it and how it was, supported. Because I know probably writing this book brought up so much other memories that they probably didn't want to face or was very hard to face.
I can say a little more about that. One thing, there was a parallel track. I was doing a lot of research for this book, researching my sister and her life. I wound up sort of, she was disappeared. She'd never had a memorial. She'd never had a funeral. So I think part of the inspiration for this novel was to give her a bit of a memorial. And then that wound up taking a very literal meaning in that in 2017, I wound up doing a blood test to try to identify her remains, convinced my father to do so that same year, convinced him to do it. And then we had a memorial for her finally in 2019. So 40 years after this had happened, and none of that would have happened without the book. And my father didn't go to the memorial, but a tremendous number of people did. My sister Isabel's nanny, her high school friends, her college friends. It was a really beautiful moment. And I think the book sort of both facilitated that and then had that kind of effect. A lot of people, especially in Argentina, still don't talk about this. It's still silenced. Those wounds, you had to close them for both safety reasons and emotional reasons. And sometimes it's really hard to reopen those wounds. But I think for a lot of people, maybe not my father, but for a lot of people, the book and the memorial felt very healthy in that engaged conversation and memory in the right kind of way.
And I think it probably is helping a lot of families, you know,
I hope
help.
so.
Yeah. Tell us more about how you created the Colonel character, as well as the relationship between the Colonel and Tomás. Was the ghost real? I know you said Isabel's kind of been the ghost, but were all the characters ghosts?
No, Tomás is definitely not a ghost. At least not. He is maybe emotionally a bit of a ghost, but he's not. The Colonel is. The Colonel is sort of the Virgil to Tomás's Dante, taking him through the underworld. And he's a mentor and friend, and sort of he's also, so as this, sorry, I'm a bit inarticulate, but in terms of the creation, it's sort of hard to explain. I mean, the Colonel is sort of maybe just like my eccentric side a little bit, but he's also a little, for me, like the incarnation, a tiny bit of certain aspects of the Argentine spirit. Tomás flees and becomes a little American, and in that shapes him, whereas the Colonel he loves tango, he loves red meat and wine, and he's a sort of sardonic, he's not really machista, but he's got this kind of intellectual, I don't know, he's just, for me, I think I wrote him kind of as like almost like the spirit of Argentina guiding Tomás through this underworld. He's more complicated than that. He has more layers. He's also someone who I kind of wanted the most fun character in the book to be one who was a villain, essentially. I mean, he is a manager of detention centers, that is to say torture centers. So he has done really bad things, but Tomás, our protagonist, loves him. I think many readers love him, like being in his presence. He's sort of one of the only really funny characters in the book. And I was interested in the fact that, like, we have this idea that good and evil are very separate in people, that, there's good guys and bad guys. And I wanted all characters to be in between. And the Colonel is maybe the most extreme example of that, in that he's perhaps the most likable in certain ways, but also the least, he's certainly not moral.
Yeah, there was times when I read the book, I liked him, and I had to grin a little bit and laugh. And then there's other times where I just did not like him at all. What is he doing? One of the book club wanted to know what the symbolism of the cemetery was throughout the book.
Well, the cemetery is sort of, it is just sort of a beautiful city of the dead. Like the actual Recoleta cemetery is that. It's a sort of small city of the dead. And for me, that is sort of metaphorically like apt for Buenos Aires as Tomás experiences it. It's sort of metaphorically apt for how my father even experiences Argentina. He does not like going back. He tries to avoid it. He said to me once that when I moved there to live, why would I want to move to Argentina, to a country of death? And the Recoleta cemetery is sort of this manifestation of this like very beautiful place it's a city of death. And I think that's sort of the largest connection. I mean, there's other elements in that. It sort of like has class elements and things like that, but that's the real main reason. And I just liked it. When I lived there, I would go on walks there all the time.
Really? Okay. Did you already have the title of the book, Hades, Argentina, before or after you finished the book?
I had it before. I tried for a long time, for maybe a year. The first year of working on the book, I tried to write it as a realist novel, like started in 1976, maybe go all the way in 1986, and sort of it was going to be a longer book. I had a different title at that time. I was really struggling with it. And then I had the idea for this underworld journey. And that was when it sort of like a light bulb, the whole thing kind of came together, and I it became Hades, Argentina at that point. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. When you finished the book, was it a relief? And did you find closure? And did it help you heal?
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I would say the memorial for my sister that we held in 2019, which was right around the time we submitted which was a week before we submitted the book to publishers, definitely helped me heal. I mean, it felt, I had a lot of insecurity about feeling like a fraud, writing my sister's story, writing the story of a time I did not live through. That was all, I felt like a bit of an imposter. The memorial definitely alleviated that. The book itself, I mean, I definitely felt relief about it, but I think the process of finishing it gets drawn out from publication. People read it in this trickle. So I'm still both like the emotions around finishing this book are still sort of happening. My father did a translation for the book into Spanish, which maybe the book is going to be published in Argentina and probably this year, and that'll be a big moment for it too. So like in a sense, yes, like ultimately it is all helping, but it's just been more spread out than just the ending, if that makes sense.
Well, but that's wonderful that it's going to be translated into Spanish. I think one of the other book clubs wanted to know if there was going to be a Spanish version of the book.
There is,
So,
yeah.
yes.
I don't know when yet it'll come out, but probably this year, I think.
Okay, so another question. You're a book editor, so does that help your writing process?
It depends. Sometimes it feels like it does. Sometimes it feels it really doesn't. It does in the sense that I am more comfortable maybe than many writers in retooling, rewriting, going back to the drawing board and trying something else, because as an editor, I tell writers to do that all the time. I'm like, second half of the book's just not working. You kind of got to throw it out and try something different, or try restructuring it, or, it allows me to be aware of how many possibilities there are with the manuscript. I think a lot of writers get stuck in the manuscript as it is. So in that sense, it's really helpful. In the sense that it's not helpful is that as an editor, I have a strong sense of the market. My job is about selling books and knowing what'll get coverage, knowing what'll do well, and all of this stuff. And that's a really terrible voice to have in your head as a writer. You do not want to be writing books so as to sell them. It's just not what you want to be thinking about. And being an editor it's inevitable that I think about those things, and that can be paralyzing. So.
Another question in regards to the same topic here is, I'm sure you have editors who are editing your book. Are they hard on you because of you being a book writer and an editor?
So I have, my agent and then an editor. I don't think they're any harder with me than they would be with other authors. I think I am more afraid of being annoying because I am also an editor, and I know that writers can be annoying to their editors. They can be really anxious. They can be like, what's happening with this or that or that, and so I overcompensate in the other direction. I'm like, I'll let like months go by and then be like, I have just one question. Will you just listen to me for one second? But no, I think I think they maybe take it for granted that I like know what's going on when I don't always, because but I think they treat me like any other author by and large.
Okay. One of the other book clubs wanted to know about Isabel. This book was about your sister Isabel, and Isabel is your sister. She's the character in the book. And how did you were able to, I guess, describe her in the book if you didn't really know a lot about her or what she actually did?
A lot of conversations. I mean, so the two things I'll say is, one is that there is a lot of fiction here. I mean, the personality, I think, is Isabel's, and the ultimate fact that she was in the resistance. But you talk to people about someone, you get a lot of different versions of them. You get stories that are very different. So, for example, a lot of people focused on how headstrong Isabel was, how passionate, how she could also tend toward depression. But then I remember I talked to some of her high school friends, and they were like, Isabel was just the kindest person. She was the person on whose shoulder I would cry on. And it was just very different portraits. And what I had to always keep in mind is that it was Tomás's vision of her. So Tomás doesn't get to see all of those Isabels. I mean, there were a lot of stories I heard about my sister that didn't make it into the book because Tomás would never have had access to those stories. So that was a big part of it. And the other, I think the germinating part was, Isabel was killed with her partner, who most people said was more afraid than she was, that he would have fled if not for his love of her. And that was sort of a thing that drove a lot of the story. When I learned that really clicked a lot into place for this book.
Oh, good. So one last question. So what are you working on a new book? And will it be set in Argentina again, or?
Yes, I am, although, I don't know yet if it will be like the next book, because it's hard to write, and books get abandoned. And so I could say this and then, 5 years go by and it's a different book that ends up being published, or no book, but yes, it's set in Tierra del Fuego. The end of the proverbial end of the world. So in Argentina and in Chile. And it's also historical, but deeper historical. This takes place in the 1890s. And it's got a different sort of magic, but a bit of magic. And yeah, it's difficult, and maybe my last historical novel, because the amount of research that goes into these things is exhausting. And this one is more exhausting than the last in that regard. So anyway, that's what I'm currently working on. So
well, that's great. We look forward to seeing that book once you're done writing it. But we want to thank you again, Daniel, for spending some time with us this evening and sharing about your book. Like I said, I loved it, and I'm sure that everybody else who's going to read it it's reading an hour in the future, they're going to love it. And I think it is going to bring some comfort to some who dealt with that era.
Thank you so much for saying so, and for having me. It's been a real pleasure. I'm very grateful to you all for giving the book attention. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Daniel.
Okay, our second interview tonight is with Kathleen Alcala. She is the author of 6 award-winning books, including 4 novels, a collection of stories, and a book of essays. Kathleen is both a graduate of and instructor in the Clarion West Science Fiction and Fantasy program. Her work embraces both traditional and innovative storytelling techniques. Interviewing Kathleen is Comadre Lydia Galvan, a native Texan and proud descendant of Spanish settlers who have been ranching in South Texas since the 1750s. Her ancestors arrived in Mexico in the 1530s as conversos, Jewish families who converted to Catholicism and were forced to immigrate to the New World to escape the Spanish Inquisition. They were among the first settlers in Saltillo, Mexico. Lydia is semi-retired after a successful 43-year career as a healthcare executive. Comadre, take it away.
Thank you. Kathleen, I have to tell you, I really wanted to interview you, even though Laura, my best friend, Laura Espadas, is a friend of yours, and I'm so glad that Laura was gracious enough to let me interview you, because I loved your book. It was particularly relevant to me because I only found out last year about my genealogy. We suspected, but we were not sure.
I was gonna say, are we related?
Well, let's see. The furthest I went back was 900, the year 900 and something. And there's
Goodness.
rabbis all the way through till about the year 1500. We had no idea. We thought maybe something, but not as much as there was.
Mhm.
But we'll have to talk. We may be related.
Yeah, it's surprising because new information is uncovered every day. So I know a lot more about that whole subject than when I wrote Spirits of the Ordinary.
Well, I'll have to pick your brain later. I'd like to know, and our readers would like to know, what was your inspiration for writing the book?
Well, the book is based on the story of my great-grandparents, and who were from Saltillo and lived in Saltillo. In fact, everyone in the family lived in Saltillo between when they ran away from Spain and when my grandfather left. But what happened was my great-grandfather had the gold fever and wanted to go out and spend all his time in the desert looking for gold. And my great-grandmother would have none of it. So she kicked him out of the house. And because the legal system in Mexico is in some ways more progressive than in the United States, she could hang on to the money. So that was the genesis of this novel, which as Daniel has discovered, novels take their own way, whether you like it or not.
Well, it's got so much detail on Jewish and Catholic and Native history and customs, as well as the Casas Grandes, which is the cliff dwellings. There's just so much detail in there.
Well,
Is
I
it-
love doing research, I have to say. I can always read one more book on a subject, or go to one more library, or interview one more person.
Well, one of the questions was, have you been on site at any of these locations?
Yes, but really it was after the fact. I wrote the book it was published in 1997.
Uh-huh.
And some of the research I did was in my uncle's library in Chihuahua, Mexico. So that was before that time. But I didn't visit Saltillo as an adult until after I had written the book. And, took a bus, got off the bus, and within 5 minutes met a relative. And they told me amazing stories. But it's only much more recently that we've had this business with genealogy that people and DNA that people can connect with each other that way.
Well, you had so much information on the Native American peoples, which the detail was incredible. I've got to tell you, congratulations on that.
Oh.
You don't usually find that in many books.
Thank
Was
you.
it all purely research?
It was a little bit of information about my a different great-grandmother. And I have to say that's what the next book is about the Opata. And the same publisher is going to bring that book out. Here it is in Spanish in softcover, but it's going to be republished in English.
Oh, good.
So that was a really hard story to write, actually, because when you do the work and you realize what happened to these people, what tragedies they survived, and somehow it's different when you know who that person is.
I would agree. And we'll have to have a conversation later about that. If you're from the same lineage as I am, we're related to Juan de Onate, unfortunately.
I was going to say there's one other person who
Yeah.
I'm a descendant of. And so it's a very interesting thing to contemplate, this notion of being a descendant of both the indigenous people and the conquistadores. And somehow until fairly recently, I thought, well, you know, here were these people, they left Spain fearing for their lives. They barely, you know, squeaked their way onto a boat. But that doesn't make them saints, right? When they got to the New World, they were just as bloody minded as the people perpetuating the Inquisition. So here we all are.
Ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So many writers base characters on family members or friends or the history of family members. Is your book based on some of that?
Well, as I said, my great grandparents were the couple who initially inspired the book. And I, you know, this is what, two generations later. So of course I didn't know them. I think it's also a safe distance from which to write about your family if anyone's contemplating doing that sort of thing, because no one else is alive either who remembers the people. My cousins and my sisters did know my grandmother, who was half Bogota and half Irish, who was born in Arizona. And I did have some trepidation in writing about her until my cousin, Miguel, said, yes, that's just what she was like. She was very easygoing and funny and gentle and didn't hold grudges against people. So not knowing that I was holding my breath about that, it was a great relief to hear.
So you did base some of it on family stories that were passed down.
Yes.
Okay. Get that. Some of us suspected that, but we weren't sure.
Yes. Well, the whole notion of a Jewish background, when I wrote this book, there wasn't very much information about it. And no one outside of my family had ever talked to me about it until I was doing this work. And I was interviewing someone here in Seattle and mentioned this was at the 500th anniversary of the Inquisition, 1992. And I said, we think, you know, this might be part of our family history. And Isaac Myman, I'll never forget it. He said, well, does your family light candles on Friday night? Do they have prayers at certain times? Do they play cards? Apparently this was a way of like a memory aid, that people would pretend that they were playing cards, but in fact they were learning scripture and studying Torah this way. So I had to say, no, I don't know anything about this. But then I started doing more research.
This is my most intriguing question that I have to ask. Manzana and Membrillo, the brother and sister. You wrote this 25 years ago. At the time that you wrote it, did you consider them transgender? Because that was not something that was even really much people were aware of.
Well, I'd say they're non-binary.
Non-binary. Okay.
Non-binary, in that they're neither one or the other. And when I wrote them, I thought, well, medically, probably it's not possible for these people to exist. But in fact, it turned out that we don't know that much about twins. We don't know everything about twins. And so I was able to, you know, it was okay that I wrote them as they are. And I have to tell you, as soon as you started asking that, people ask about the twins more than any other characters in the book. And recently someone was even saying, oh, I want you to write more. I want them to have their own book. So.
Well, they were intriguing. The way that you described them, that they were fascinating. It was, I did want more. I have to admit, I did want more. Now, the conquistadores were always looking for, and I don't know how to pronounce it, Cibola?
Cibola.
Cibola.
Cibola. Yeah.
The legendary 7 cities of gold.
Mhm.
And, did you always envision the cliff dwellings like the ones in Mexico and Chihuahua as part of that vision?
I don't know. At this point, I really can't remember if I knew that it would take them to that point. this is my first novel, and I was just in the whirlwind, trying to complete the arc of transformation that Gabrielle goes through. Mhm.
Well, now Zacharias had an incredible character arc.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Incredible. From an obsessed gold prospector to a baker to a shaman, and then back the other direction to a Shabbos. It was very interesting. Was he a vehicle for a particular message that you were trying to give the reader?
I don't think I had a particular message. Again, some of those things were based on the actual person. He did go off and do some interesting things, including open bakeries in order to support himself. And they were recognizable because there were paintings on the outside. So that came from the real historical record.
Okay. So one of the readers asked another question: that Caravals practiced their religion in secret for fear of persecution. And the first edition of the book was written 25 years ago. Do you think of the storyline as purely historical, or could it be happening today?
Well, history keeps repeating itself, right? So we're looking at a war in the Ukraine right now, and there are a lot of Jews who live in the Ukraine, and their ancestors fled from somewhere else. And right now, all these people are sitting in train stations in Poland. So I think this could happen again.
Okay. One of the things that struck me was the fluidity of all the different religions that you mentioned. It was almost like they kind of melded into each other. Did you do that deliberately?
That's all really historical. It's called synchronism, and people often do this. When people came from Africa to the southern United States, they brought their gods and goddesses who they ended up worshiping through the saints in the Catholic churches. And I think in Mexico, if you look around, the churches are built on the former sites of the temples. Mm-hmm. So you see these things like palimpsest, painted one over the other. And so even in people, you will see a combination of practices.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think of some of the practices during the Day of the Dead in Mexico. Yes. And in certain parts of Mexico, it's very definitely much more of the indigenous customs that they had. And the priests would put their customs over them to try to, their rituals over them to try to convert or teach the native Mexicans. And then there's also Spain, where some of the, that I remember in a visit that I had, where some of the Catholic churches are over the mosques.
Yes,
Kind of
deliberately, yeah.
Shocking. But the other people had questions about some of the other characters, and they were very curious about, and you've already answered the question. They wanted to know what happened to some of the characters, and are you going to continue them in another book, specifically Corey, the American photographer, and what happened to Zacharias again, and what happened to Estela and the baby, and lots of questions.
Well, there's more excitement ahead. I wrote 3 books of historical fiction based on family history, and The Flower in the Skull, which is about my indigenous background, doesn't follow that directly from Spirits of the Ordinary, but Treasures in Heaven does. And it's about the feminist movement in Mexico. So there are probably some old copies around if you want to look for them. But I think that Raven Chronicles Press will continue to reissue these 3 novels. So they will be in new editions.
Good, wonderful. People are curious about this, so I'm glad you brought it up. And it leads me to another question that was asked: is women are key protagonists in this book, would you call Estela, Magdalena, and Corey feminists?
In their way, yes, they certainly were. They all did pretty scary things. I mean, I think about it. Would I do these things? I don't know. And some people don't have a choice, right? Magdalena is a very pragmatic woman who's had a very hard life.
Mhm.
And the characters in general, I tell people I try to set up villains, anti-heroes in these books, but I always develop too much sympathy for them. So, so it's hard for me to construct someone like that. Listening to Danielle talk, I was reminded of Robert Stone wrote a book called A Flag for Sunrise, which is about an unknown dictatorship that's very much like Argentina at the time. And there's a horrible person in it, a military person. Someone asked him how he could write someone like that. And Stone said, all of my characters are a little piece of me. They're all part of me. And I thought, yes, we have to reach in ourselves for that black spot that we ignore the rest of the time. But we're capable of both great good and great evil.
Well, it was interesting how your characters were nuanced that way. Nobody was purely evil that I remember, and nobody was purely good. Everybody was a little bit, Zacharias in particular seemed, he was a real character in that he left his wife, but he didn't want to be unfaithful, and he felt so guilty, and it took a lot for him to not be faithful, and Estela was a little bit more pragmatic about it. in her, she was proper, but she was still towards the end, not so much.
Not so much. Well,
Much.
wait
Yes.
till you get to Treasures in Heaven.
Oh, really? Okay, well, I'm going to have to get that book. So what about the scene of the massacre at the Casa Grande? Is that based in fact? I mean, I don't know a lot about the Casas Grandes in Mexico. I know about Mesa Verde and some of the other cliff dwellings in
Right.
the West.
I don't know that it happened. It was already what more of an archaeological scene. People weren't actively living there at this time, except as envisioned in my novel. But there have been a number of uprisings in that part of Mexico where the indigenous people have basically become enslaved to work in these mines, in mines that are often owned by American companies. So that's sort of going on now. I'm about to have a great adventure. I'm going to go to Sonora and visit the Opata villages and meet someone I've been corresponding with for a couple of years who's also from my tribe. So that's one of the ways that people make their living in northeastern Mexico, is working in the mines.
I wasn't aware that that's still going on.
Yeah.
That's terrible. It's terrible.
Well, you live in an area where there's not very many ways to earn cash, earn money. Your choices are pretty limited.
Mhm. One of the questions that was asked also was if you could give us a tease about the next book, and you've kind of mentioned a little bit about it, about the second book in the series, and then and the third one that you've had. Could you tell us just a little bit more about them so people
Yes, the next one is called The Flower in the Skull,
know?
and it is about my indigenous roots. And for that book, I went and stayed at a place called the Amarind Foundation that's outside of Tucson, Arizona. And it's a museum. It has the largest library on indigenous people in the country. It's a private library. And they have these little casitas where you can stay, or at least you used to be able to stay. So I lived there for 3 weeks and just went through every single book that might have anything on the Opata, because it hadn't been documented well at all. People would just say, I've never heard of the Opata. I've never heard of the Opata. So I wrote this book and I thought, fine, this is going to be my memorial to the people. And then a funny thing happened in that I started getting one email and then another email and then an invitation to join a chat group on Yahoo Mexico. And then it turned out there were a lot of people like me who have one or two grandparents who were opata. And we live all over the Western United States. I would say the largest concentration of people live in the Los Angeles area now. But there are two other people near me in the Northwestern United States. And then, of course, many people in Arizona and Sonora. So many of the customs that I had to look up in anthropological monographs are still in practice. People are eating this stuff, they're weaving this stuff, they're putting up the buildings in which these things happen. The language is sort of down to a scattering of words, you know, and nobody seems to be really fluent, but that can be fixed too. So it's been quite a journey to get to the flower in the skull.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like you're contributing to people knowing a little bit more about that area. I know most of us have. If we're considered Hispanic, we have some indigenous
Sure.
in us. I have 12%, so that's a great grandparent somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully it was consensual. That's all I can say.
Well, right. That's the other thing, and that's also talked about in this book, in The Flower in the Skull.
I'm going to have to get it. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say about either book that I've not asked you about?
I'm really thankful that you were willing to share Spirits of the Ordinary with a wider audience, because I've had people come up and say, you know, I hadn't heard anyone talk about that in years, or that turn of phrase, you know, and of course I'm writing in English, but translating from the Spanish. So every time a book gets read again and talked about, it gives the book new life. And so I feel that that's what you're doing with me. Even though I'm writing new books, you're giving my old books life, and I really appreciate it.
Well, it looks like somebody may have a question. Let me make sure. She said, Rosemary Guzman Hook asked something about Nahuatl.
Nahuatl is the language. Yes, it's the common language group that the Opata belong to.
Oh,
and
okay.
so it's I think it's what the Aztec people speak, and so it's a very well-known language, and there are people who still speak it. The Opata language, there are actually 3 languages depending on the region that people come from. So I was thinking about that in terms of going, if I could just learn how to introduce myself and say hello in Opata, I would be really happy. It would give me great pleasure.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much. It was a pleasure interviewing you. I hope you don't mind if I drop you a line every now and then. We may be related because of you.
Probably, yes. Thank you so much, Lydia, and thank you to all of you for hosting me today. I appreciate it.
It was our pleasure.
Bye, Laura.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.
You're on mute, Nora.
It was wonderful. I had such a good time listening to you all. Our thanks to authors Daniel Loedel, Kathleen Alcala, and the publishers Riverhead Books and Raven Chronicles Press for their generous donation of books to our early registrants. Thank you as well to our interviewers, Comadres Kim Montoya and Lydia Galvan. We are so grateful for you spending time with us this evening. We enjoyed the sharing of perspectives and insights from your work and your lives. We truly treasure the opportunity to learn about you, and we feel much more connected with you. We also want to thank our audience for taking the time to join us tonight, and thank you for those who submitted questions. And we'd like to thank all our volunteers without whom this book club and all the associated work would not happen. Mil gracias. Please remember to support our authors by writing a review of their books on sites like Amazon, Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, and other sites. Those reviews, they carry weight with the publishers as well as with other readers. Buy books to support our authors, and if your library does not have a book you want to read, ask them to order it. And please attend your virtual local book club meetings and bring a friend or two. Remember, it's open to everyone, men, women, and not just Latinos. Our March books are LA Weather by Maria Amparo Escandon and Latinitas, Celebrating 40 Big Dreamers by Juliet Menendez. Thank you all for your continued support of our book club and Latino literature. Please join us in celebrating our quinceañera throughout the year. Stay safe, wear your masks, I think, right? That keeps changing right now. And good night, and always read Latino literature. Good night.
Good, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. To stop the recording.